I gave a reasonably technical talk, I think, last year, Kanban the hard way. That was a talk that I'd given a few times, refined it over the months. And I was just beginning to talk about values. This talk is really centered on values and what we call the agendas. Rather than being technical, there's no maths in it. Don't go into advanced concepts, classes of service, scheduling policies, all those kind of things. It's much more about why would we want to use Kanban, what do we hope to achieve from it, how is using Kanban going to help us achieve our ambitions for our teams, for our organisation, and so on. So Kanban's not so hidden agendas. I'm going to ask you first. You can just shout a few words out. And can you just think of a few words that describe what you want from Kanban, particularly if you're using Kanban already, but perhaps you're new to Kanban and you're thinking, oh, it might help me with this. What is the this? No, it's early in the morning. Change. It's a good one. Holistic approach, that's a good one. Let's have one more. Flow, I heard, amongst all the other words. Those are all good answers. If you're still struggling to think of it, I'm just going to put this in the context of a particular team. So this is one of the teams that was documented in David Anderson's Kanban book. I don't know the names of all the people on this picture. I do know that's Dan Vacanti on the left there, chairing the meeting. Behind him on the wall is about $1 million worth of work on his Kanban board. And we'll have a look at that board in a moment. So just to ask yourself, what would a team doing an $11 million project that's under time pressure and so on, what would they want from Kanban? I don't know if your situation is similar or very different. There are lots of different types of teams using Kanban. What would they want from Kanban? Again, to help you put into words what it is you might want, we've got this thing called the values exercise. There's a version of this that you can use with your teams. You can spend about 45 minutes on it. I've seen teams done it. I've facilitated it in classes. I've facilitated it at events. I know other people are downloading the exercise. It's freely available, and they're giving me good feedback on it. We're going to run the super quick version that takes just a couple of minutes. And what we've done, we've taken the foundational principles and the core practices of the Kanban method, and I've abstracted out of them 9 values. And that's really what the rest of the talk is going to be about. Now, to make it easy, we're going to start from the bottom. So out the 9 values in a random order are customer focus, agreement, collaboration, flow, leadership. Flow was one of the ones mentioned earlier on, so that was good. Leadership, transparency, understanding, respect, and balance. So starting from the bottom, which of those do you think goes with encourage acts of leadership at all levels in your organisation, from individual contributors to senior management? Leadership. That one's pretty easy. Now, we're not evil. There aren't trick questions here, and I've deliberately started at the bottom to make it as easy as possible. Right, so that's leadership. Next one, initially respect existing roles, responsibilities, and job titles. I'm going to have an answer from someone other than Pavel here, I think. Respect, good. Agree to pursue evolutionary change. You might actually be wondering what that means, and we will get to that later in the talk. But agree to pursue evolutionary change. What one value do we think that might be? Agreement. Nice and easy. Start with what do you do now? This is the hardest one. This is one that catches people out. And there's not wrong answers here, but there is my answer. I'm looking for my answer. Understanding, great. All right, so that's the foundational principles. Agreement, respect, understanding, agreement, respect. I've been saying for years. It was in the Kanban the hard way talk you heard last year. How would you expect to succeed without understanding, agreement, and respect? Leadership as well. Core practices. Now, again, this gets tricky because one of the practices has 2 values against it, and one of the values appears 3 times. So that makes it harder. But we'll start at the bottom again. Improve collaboratively, evolve experimentally. And there is a clue in the words. Collaboration. Implement feedback loops. This is definitely harder. Transparency, good. Make policies explicit. Transparency again, right. So now we know that transparency is the one that must be appearing more than once. It appears in one other place. Now, where do we think that might be? Visualize. Good. Right, we're getting there. Right, manage flow. There's an easy one and a harder one. Flow. Flow and customer focus. Yes, who we're flowing to is the customer. And limit work in progress. There's only one left. That's balance. Balance can mean more than just limiting work in progress, but that's where I get that from. So 9 values. And again, in a random order: customer focus, agreement, collaboration, flow, leadership, transparency, understanding, respect, and balance. Now, I don't know whether, without having actually seen the whole talk, you have a sense that some of these values mean something to you, resonate with you, might be particularly applicable in your current work context. It's a big ask to ask you now if you can think of 3 that particularly resonate with you, but we'll still just pause for a moment. And just a reminder that you can download the long version of this exercise. It's one you can do with your teams. Spending some time, first of all, doing that mapping, and then thinking about which 3 respond to you as individuals in your team, which 3 most represent what's needed by the team, by the wider organisation, so on, is a really powerful exercise. There's also a website called melstrong.com. I'll be very honest with you, since I started working on my book, I've not put a lot of work into the website, but if you wish, you can create a profile and put your 3 values on your profile there. I will mention the book again, I promise. Right, 9 values, 3 agendas. So what we're doing, I mentioned choose 3. I found very early on that these actually organise very well into groups of 3, and I had some really rubbish names for them early on. Now, with a bit of collaborative work around the last autumn's conference season between the London conference and the Central Europe conference, which was just the space of a weekend last autumn, with help from a few people, including Andy Carmichael, who's one in the room somewhere. I can't see him. There he is, Andy, over there. We came up with these 3 names: sustainability for transparency, balance, and collaboration; service orientation for customer focus, flow, and leadership; and survivability, the strange one, for understanding, agreement, and respect. So dive into the sustainability one, and this is the one that I think most of you will recognise most quickly. So our guys in the room, what do these people on their $11 million project with their $1 million worth of work on the board hope to achieve or hope to obtain from using Kanban? What I've done, here's a picture of their board, and I'd hope you would agree that for a project under a bit of time pressure, with a big budget, they actually had to hire people quickly enough that they changed the contract market in the Seattle area while they were doing it. I mean, the contract prices went up. They were hiring fast enough and big enough to do it. So it's a project of significant change. I'm assuming that most of you know what a Kanban board is, how it works. Very briefly, the columns indicate what state the work is in, what the work needs. If there's work that needs development, there might be work that needs analysis or testing or whatever. So in a very, very high level way, it sort of gives you a visualization of the workflow. Here's some horizontal organization as well. There are some small groups of people. There are also people that float around as well. So it's not a completely fixed organization. The work on the left, these are just ideas really. It's possible they know very little more about the work than the few words written on the big post-it note. And we're going to focus on just one piece of work down here. And we're going to think about the person who's currently working on that piece of work. I happen to know it's just one person, not several, because their name is written on the orange sticky in front of the yellow sticky. So what choices do they have? What decisions can they make? And they've got several obvious choices. One is just to keep working on what they're doing, where they are on that piece of work. It's in a column called code, so some kind of development's going on. They could hand that piece of work over to someone else to continue the next piece of work, perhaps some testing, some performance testing, some user validation, whatever it might be. Or they might follow the work themselves. There's nothing about this board that says that the people are functionally organised. In fact, quite the opposite. We can see that people are organised across each stream. They might finish what they're doing and help someone else close to them in their little huddle of 2 or 3 developers. They might decide that another piece of work is more urgent, or that this piece of work is coming to an end. We can now help somebody else. They might help somebody in a similar state with other work that's in a similar state, but in a different group. They can look at all the work across their particular stream. They can look at their work in the backlog. And depending on the team, depending on habits, depending on the sort of norms within the team, they will have some accepted norms of behaviour, some accepted practices of what people do, what are sensible decisions that people are going to make. And that brings predictability. And it's always good for teams when there's a certain amount of predictability. When I know that Pavel gets to a certain stage that he's likely to do a particular thing, it's easier. It's just easier for teams when they know how people are behaving. But that doesn't mean he can only do that. He could have a look at that. He could have a look at that. But the obvious choices are very visible on the board, and the norms can be documented, or they can just emerge from the behaviour of the team. And this is kind of transparency and balance. It's not the whole of transparency and balance, but it's about providing just the right amount of organisation to the work, organising the work visually on the board, so that a self-organising team can make good decisions and make predictable decisions that other team members will understand. The balance comes from making sure that there's not too much work or too little, not too much choice or too little, just the right amount of choice and constraint that allows the work to flow well. Some sense of shared expectations, written policies, or just tacit norms within the team. And some sense of feedback as well. They can see the work progress, the work moves across the board as it progresses to completion. They have some, and with other tools as well, some sense that they are winning. So that's transparency and balance. There's a third value here, collaboration. And quite a few myths around collaboration. It's a very one of these vague words for some people. I think it means something very specific. I mean, you might think just because some of the people in this picture are smiling, that they must be a collaborative team. A happy team working together. That's what collaboration is all about. Something rather more specific than that. And I like to think of collaboration as a thing. Lennon and McCartney. It's not just two people. Lennon and McCartney was a thing. Their relationship was a thing. They weren't even nice to each other all the time. But through their relationship, they created something special. The same with the guys on the right. Who recognises the ones on the right? A few of you do. That's Watson and Crick. So that's the model of DNA there. So creative relationships, problem solving, all those kind of things. And there's lots of research that shows that creativity is enhanced by the right amount of collaboration. A lot of what looks like solo creativity is actually sparked by, informed by collaboration that's either very visible or hidden. And it's a very high leverage activity. When we notice, when our self-organising team notices that the way they're describing, the way they're constraining, the way they're organising the work isn't quite right, they can change it. It's just rubbing a line off on the whiteboard, moving a few stickers around. If you're using an electronic tool, it's just a few clicks of the mouse to reorganise the design of the board, and thereby influence the way the system is going to work. And a few specific ways in which that might happen. In the picture on the left, I'm just thinking of when you're looking at the way that work flows across your team. Are there places where the interaction is uncollaborative? Great example is code review. I used to get really frustrated with code reviews. I don't know if you find code reviews frustrating, but I used to find code would sit for days and sometimes even weeks in the inboxes of a senior developer. And the person who'd written the code would be pulling his hair out, wondering when his piece of work was going to get reviewed. The senior developer would say, "Oh, it's much more efficient when I do all these things at once." And the poor developer who's sent his code off for review, 2 weeks after he did it, he's got a whole load of changes to make, and he's got to get back to where he was, understand why the code was the way it is, understand why the reviewer wants these changes, and so on. Contrast that with pair programming, where the conversation about whether this is the right way or the wrong way happens in moments. It happens as the work is being done. There isn't that delay, and so on. So teams I've worked with, very often, they're not necessarily mandated pair programming, but they've said where pair programming is happening, then a code review isn't necessary. And that actually gives quite a good incentive to people to pair, and that's worked very well for us. Another way of looking at collaboration, I mean, just looking around your teams, are there people who don't get the opportunity to collaborate? I'm not suggesting that, we should make people collaborate all the time. I mean, people need space as well. But is there something about the way that you are working that means that some people are always kept in the corner, kept in their pigeonhole, allowed to do only one particular thing, and not given the opportunity to collaborate in the problem solving of the team as a whole? Another aspect of collaboration I'd just like to mention is when the team solves a problem together, they're a stronger team, and that's normally something to celebrate. Over time, however, the team gets closer and closer together as it's solving its problems, doing its work together, as its expectations of the behaviours of the other team members are clearer, and so on and so on. But there is a negative to that. That can cause barriers between teams and other parts of the organisation. Information gets hidden. There's a not invented here. There's all sorts of syndromes that are about let's keep it within the team. So in a sense, collaboration can be anti-scale. That's not to say that it's always anti-scale, and we'll look later about ways of thinking about collaboration that are in the direction of scale. But it's worth bearing in mind that it has that dark side to it. So that's the sustainability agenda: transparency, balance, and collaboration. If you consider yourselves as a member of an agile team, you'll be able to map most, perhaps all of your current practices, artifacts, those kind of things, to one of those three values, I'm sure. We could do a quiz now, but in the interest of time, we'll move on. But it's really about self-organisation, just the right amount of constraint for a team to work well, effectively, and spending some time working creatively, not just delivering the work, but improving the system as well. And that is the Kanban that many of you will understand. So we'll move on to service orientation, customer focus, flow, and leadership. And there's a thing called the Kanban lens. David came up with this last summer. A way to view what you do now. The what you do now is in italics. You may remember that from the principles. So the very first foundational principle of Kanban starts with what you do now. A way to do what you do now. Creative work is service-oriented. What we do, for the most part, is for other people. We achieve something by helping other people achieve something, or we achieve something by meeting someone else's need, and so on. Service delivery involves workflow. We have to, at the very minimum, we have to understand what's needed, and we have to make it, we have to deliver it. That's 3 stages. That doesn't mean we necessarily want a highly defined workflow, but there is some workflow involved. And workflow involves a series of knowledge discovery activities. For the most part, when we receive a request, we actually know very, very little. And we need to explore the customer need. We need to explore our technological capability. We need to check afterwards that we actually did meet the need, and so on. So again, at a very, very minimal level, there is some knowledge discovery to be done. And that's actually really good to think about software development, creative knowledge work in general as a knowledge discovery process, and thinking about it in those terms can actually help us do it better, help us meet needs better. Looking at this at scale, this is a rather sort of complicated picture, but meant to illustrate how things can work, not necessarily with Kanban, but how things generally work in a larger organisation. We have some source of requirements on the left. We have teams in parallel working on building stuff. We have, perhaps some kind of common team for testing stuff, deploying stuff. We deliver it into the cloud. Eventually, customers get to interact with it. As well as something shared, we're dependent on services as well. When I worked in an investment bank, we had a shared team for database-related stuff, a shared team for middleware-related stuff, and so on. And if you don't pay attention to those dependencies, or the way you do work with those dependent teams, then your work doesn't flow as well. So think about customer focus and flow when you're working at these kinds of scale. Taking the values of the first agenda, in particular transparency and balance, and collaboration as well. A lot of flow problems stem from either having too much work going on, work lost in the gaps between teams, or failures of collaboration, failures of managing work in progress, and so on. It's easy to say those things, and it's easy to say do those things better, and the work will flow better, and it will. It's harder to actually do it better in a way that actually makes a massive difference. A better question, and one that I have found genuinely has made a massive difference, a profound difference, a difference way more than I ever expected, was to ask this kind of question. How soon will we know that we have met a customer need? And if you're working down here or down here, asking that question can make a massive difference. I managed a team in Hungary where I was very frustrated by the fact that we would keep delivering features and then find that those features weren't being used. And I think that's a fairly common story. What's really frustrating about it is that we were actually asked to build them in the first place, and the people who asked for them had kind of lost interest by the time we got round to delivering them. And I blamed them for that. That's what you do when you're a development manager. And I said, right, so at the end of the process, I'm going to insist that the developer and the customer sit down and have a conversation about the value of this work. And I want to receive an email that confirms to me that this piece of work has met a customer need, that the end user is actually getting value out of using it. And I wasn't quite as rude about it, but that was kind of what was, kind of where I was. Blaming the customer and imposing this solution as a way of addressing this problem, this problem of work started that was never properly finished. The difference was profound. I found that knowing that this conversation was going to happen, the developer and the customer worked together on those final implementation steps, making sure all the static data was in place and all those other little niggly things that need to be done for something to be used successfully on day one. They tested it together to make sure it actually did what the customer had wanted. They worked together during development through initially capturing the idea. And we definitely got better at prioritizing because we prioritized things where we knew that it was going to finish in a good conversation. So my motives were negative, but what we actually achieved was a proper collaborative process with developers and customers working very closely together right through the process. We didn't have bad customers, we just had collaboration not working well enough. So that's one of the early values, but it was catalyzed by asking this kind of question. And you can ask this question from a flow perspective as well. Where is the work waiting? What keeps tripping us up? Where are the dependencies that we're failing to manage well enough, and so on. You can use your understanding of the flow. You can use your Kanban board even as a thinking tool to organize your examination of your process in those kind of terms. So how soon will we know that we've met a customer need? A really good question. So collaboration and leadership. I mentioned that collaboration can draw people together, and that's actually something to celebrate most of the time, but it can work against scale. And I'm just going to show a couple of models about addressing that scale problem. And the first is from Morten Hansen, and it's this concept called T-shaped leadership. T-shaped leadership, you've heard of T-shaped people. People have a specialism, really amazingly good at one thing, but they're also broad enough that they're not useless outside of their one specialism, that they can actually support a team, they can take pieces of work through a large part or all of the process, and so on. T-shaped leadership is about nurturing collaboration within the team, making sure that it's positive in the team, but also encouraging effective, disciplined collaboration across a wider scope as well. So addressing problems of flow, making sure we're talking to the customer, understanding where requirements are coming from, preempting the wrong kind of requirements, and all those kind of things. Another one is the Triad. So Tribal Leadership is the book that I read about this. I've also encountered it in other places. Some of you might have heard in the church there's something called prayer triplets. My wife is a member of one. The KGB, to use another extreme, famously used triads. The idea of a triad is that one person, or each person in the triad, supports the relationship between the other two, and that makes into a strong three-way relationship. At its most basic, it is introducing two people to some common purpose. Now, I'm going to put two people on the spot here. Patrick at the back. Wave your hands, Patrick. He's speaking later. And where's Greg? Greg. Right, so I first met Patrick in about 2011, I think it would be. Around then, and we were already talking, over email and whatever, through our blogs, way before we actually met in person. Patrick is one of the people I bounce ideas off. Very good person to know. Greg, he was one of the very first people to respond to my values stuff at the beginning of last year. And I've come to value him in recent weeks as a technical reviewer of my book. Now, I know that they have an interest in complexity, Cynefin, those kind of things. So do I. I briefly write on that stuff in my book. And last night, I discovered in the pub that they had never met each other before. I introduced them. Today, Greg gives Patrick a copy of a paper. You know, this is getting serious very quickly. Now, so that is a very simple example of how you create a triad. Now, I'm just going to ask. I don't know whether it's going to be a large number of people or a small number of people. But who, in any way at all, felt connected to either Patrick or Greg before today? It's a little show of hands. Right, who, knowing that I, Greg, and Patrick share an interest in complexity and Cynefin and have connected them, feel connected to either of those people? So if you add the people who put their hands up before, it's certainly more than it was before. We now have a network that's slightly more connected than it was before. If you know Greg, ask him to introduce you to Patrick, and vice versa. If you know me, you can ask me to introduce them to either of them, and so on. That's the simple idea of the triad. But in an organization, if we are in one part of the organization and can see that the flow would work better if two other parts of the organization talked better to each other, why not make that connection? Make sure that connection is known so that other people in the organization can make use of that connection, and so on. And this is how networks get grown. That's the triad. So in Kanban, it's not about the leader at the top doing all of this. Leadership at every level was the principle, if you remember. You don't have to wear a special hat to be a leader in Kanban. You don't have to be a manager. You don't have to be anything special to connect people. It's a skill, it's a gift, it's the one I wish I did better than I do, but it's something you can practice. And when you have a model like Triads, that's something you can practice for fun. Do it explicitly. And it's built into Kanban right from the beginning. This is the front cover of David's book. I'm stuck, I'm too busy, I'm idle, let's do something about it. And I won't spend time on this because I'm sure I did this last year, but there's an active leadership potentially in every one of those. In some contexts, those might just sound like whining, or the first three anyway. In other contexts, saying, I'm stuck, I'm busy, or I'm idle might actually be a very difficult thing to do. Certainly I would say saying I'm idle in an investment bank in 2009, like I was, would be a dangerous thing to say. It would be an act of leadership potentially to say it. Let's do something about it. I think that's a bit easier to recognize that as an act of leadership. So that's service orientation, customer focus, flow, leadership, and I found customer focus is really catalyzing of better flow, not just within a team, but from end to end, from understanding a customer need to actually meeting it. And we do need some form of leadership to enable these things to happen, to balance the dangers of collaboration. Collaboration is a wonderful thing, but it can work against scale. Leadership can be an answer to it. And lastly, the survivability agenda. Understanding, agreement, respect, How would you expect to succeed without those, as I used to say? So this is the new form of words. Kanban is the humane, start with what you do now approach to change, and that's sort of a catchphrase that runs through my book. So what do I mean by humane? Well, just think about those values like transparency, balance, respect, even customer focus. Those to me are humane values. Customer focus adds meaning to work. Balance means we're not overburdening people, and you can read humane, respectful things into each of the 9 values. Start with what you do now is what makes Kanban an evolutionary method. It's about where we are and moving forward from where we are. It's not about reaching a particular defined, designed target process model. It's not really as process-centric as you might think that it is. Talking about humane, it's worth talking about safety. I think Joshua Karieski deserves a lot of credit here for raising safety as a way of thinking about how our work works. 3 unsafe models: bravado, complacency, tampering. Bravado I got from Jim Collins' Good to Great. So that's when organisations overreach in an unsafe way. They try and make a change that is more than the organisation is capable of sustaining. Many of us have worked in organisations that have got themselves into trouble because they've overreached themselves. Again, if you're like me and come from the investment banking community, the history of your organisation is probably littered with examples of that. That was certainly true of mine. Complacency, this was Ackoff. Russell Ackoff used to say the greatest management sin of all is the sin of inaction. Just complacently letting things happen around them until the organisation is overtaken by events. And Deming, our friend Deming, probably the most influential thinker on Kanban. Of the I was going to say the ancients. It's not that long ago. But we're standing on some shoulders of giants here. Deming is the giant of whose shoulders we stand the most on. Tampering. So this is the idea that we must respond to stuff all the time. When a manager says we must never let this happen again, and the thing that we must never let happen again is just something mildly embarrassing, probably to the manager. But the way we're going to stop it happening again is with some policy, some extra cost, some extra burden, some extra overhead on the whole process. And the process gets clunkier and clunkier, heavier and heavier over time. That's one form of tampering. Tweaking the dials every time something moves out of alignment, that's more the sense of tampering that Deming was using. That's just a way that works very well in a manufacturing context. I think in a knowledge work context, just having event-driven management, I think, is quite a good metaphor that many of you will recognise. So too fast, too slow, too random. And the way of thinking about these is the J-curve effect. Again, not going to spend a lot of time on these. You probably saw this last year. But is the change too deep? Is the pain it's going to inflict more than the organisation can sustain? Is it going to take too long? Is the organisation going to run out of patience before you actually achieve the change? If the patience of your organisation is 9 months to achieve anything, after a year nothing's happened, then the change agent gets fired or promoted, one or the other. Small J's, that's the Kanban answer. These are J curves, and don't have to be tiny, but they have to be sustainable, they have to be safe, and iterate on them. And over time, as we keep doing it, we'll get good at doing it as well. We get good at change, and this is what Kanban is really all about. It's getting fitter. That means fitter for purpose. It means fitter competitively and so on. But also it's about developing a capability of change, getting the habit of doing it, thinking of it as normal, thinking that if our process hasn't changed for ages, if our board design is the same as it was 6 months ago, then actually something is wrong. I've expanded the start with what you do now principle to say a bit more of what this is about. Start with what you do now and then understanding the purpose of the system, how it serves and frustrates the customer, how it works and fails to work for those inside the system, and how to change it safely. And this I think, is actually what Kanban is all about. It's about keeping the need for change always near the surface. It's understanding what those are. It doesn't mean tinkering with, not tampering with the system all the time, not changing the board just because we've heard that it provokes the right kind of behaviours, but making things visible because they are making the symptoms of a problem more visible. They're making the impact of a problem. They're making our suspected root causes of problems more visible. It's done with understanding, and it's done with respect for the people in the system, and so on. But also, there's some skill, there's some commitment, there's some discipline to managing with understanding, agreement, and respect. You know, we actually want agreement in a way represents our ability as an organisation to deal with change. You could call that change management if you like, even though that's a word that has some negative associations. And clearly, we want to do things respectfully. That is so axiomatic for me. I'm not even going to defend it. I'm just going to say, you know, the change that we make needs to be respectful. It needs to be safe. So Kanban's not so hidden agendas. Sustainability agenda, the Kanban that many of you will recognise that you can map to the way your team works, to the practices, the processes that your team operate. Service orientation, beginning to think about how Kanban works at scale. Begin to think about a method that actually helps you meet customer needs better, to anticipate customer needs better. And we're not embarrassed about leadership either. And survivability, this is really thinking organisationally, thinking culturally as well. What's the style of organisation that we want? Do we have an organisation that can change, that's adaptable, that's resilient, all those good things? I'm just about done. A couple of quick plugs before I do finish. The first is to mention the Lean Kanban UK conference in November, November the 3rd and 4th. Save those for your diaries. You can't register yet, but I promise if you're a BCS member or you're an attendee at the conference, you'll definitely qualify for a discount. And the other thing, piece of news, I mentioned that I'm working on a book. It's actually not far off completion, and I'm delighted to be able to announce today that we've released the first 3 chapters as a free download. It's just a PDF of the first 3 chapters. You don't need to register or anything else, you just download it. I'll tweet that after I finished speaking. There's a Twitter account, Kanban Inside, that you can follow as well with news about final publication. So by the time we meet in the autumn, I expect you'll be able to get hold of a proper copy in print or something for your Kindle and so on. 1 or 2 people in the room have seen bits of it. I think I'm still the only person that has seen all of it, but it's very nearly there. So Kanban's not so hidden agendas. I hope that's given you an idea of what the purpose of Kanban is, what its values are, what it might be able to do for you. I hope some of those resonate with you. I hope some of those help fit with your ambitions for your organisation, help you understand how it fits to what your organisation is already doing. That's me done. Very happy to take a question or two. We've got a couple of minutes left, I think. Thank you. Any questions? No, we don't. Oh, yes, we do. Hi.
Can you say a bit more about balance, please? Are you talking there about efficiency?
Yeah, balance is an interesting one, and it's actually one of the ones where I could get deeply technical very quickly, which is why I kind of glossed over it. So the first and most obvious one is all about limiting work in progress. And there's a technical part to that. That's about Kanban systems are pull systems. You know, we don't put more work into the system than we're taking out to the other side, and we get flow through the system. Another benefit of limiting work in progress that you never have more work in the system than you've actually designed for. And if you're sensible, you design to have no more work in the system than your people can cope with. Some people talk about eliminating multitasking. I tend to steer away from that because people think it's only about multitasking. And it's actually much more about flow. It's much more about respectfully giving people the right amount of work, the right amount of choice, those kind of things. But there are other kinds of balance as well. There's balance between different kinds of work, is one example. It drives me nuts when I see everyone treat every piece of work as date-driven. You know, every piece of work needs to be finished by the end of the week, or every piece of work has a date attached to it, and so on, without consideration for the people doing the work, for consideration for the likely variability of the work, and all those kind of things. Not all work is alike. Some work definitely should be date-driven, but a lot of work is just urgency-driven. I say just urgency-driven. It may actually be more urgent than the date-driven work. Other work isn't urgent at all, but it's really important. You know, it's those experiments, those intangible things, those things we need to keep ticking over in the background. You know, you wouldn't call the Google 20% stuff date-driven or urgency-driven, but it was, you know, an engine of innovation in the organisation. And there's another category of work again. You know, when you have to drop everything because the you know, the trading floor's on fire. You know, that's you know, it used to cost us, I think it was $1 million an hour. Actually, it was a bigger number than that. Let's say it was $1 million an hour to be out of the market. You know, that's a different kind of work again, and we need to have balance between those different types. Balance across different time horizons, short-term, medium-term, long-term, and so on. And when you're a manager, if you're not paying attention to those kinds of balance, you know, I think you're not doing a particularly effective job as a manager. And Kanban helps make those things explicit, make them visible, and so on. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm done.